Literature review. It's the first large chapter that you will write in your thesis, and its purpose is to be a critical evaluation of the current literature. So that means that you're looking at the literature that's out there and trying to figure out where your research stands within the literature. So you're critically evaluating, which means you're not just reading, you're reviewing it and trying to find out flaws within it, trying to be selective, trying to find gaps within the research to fit yourself into a bit of a research space. So you are trying to look at the literature and find that gap. Where do you fit in? Are there any answers that are unknown? Are there any questions that have been unanswered? So really the literature review should not have any new information. It's simply a review of what you found. I think that's why the literature review is probably one of the most important parts of your thesis, particularly because it really does define and encourage the reader to understand what it is that you are going to be presenting and the importance of it. Today's focus will be on the literature review, which is the second section here, and we're going to be talking about how to plan for your literature review, how to search for literature, how to refine that search to find those papers that can really add substance to your literature review, and also how to actually write it and how to structure the review in detail. So thinking about the structure of a literature review, you may have seen something like this described before, which is sort of an upside-down triangle. And this essentially is the structure of a literature review. So you want to start off with the background. And so as you can see, the background here includes everything that's sort of as general as possible. So you want to be as general as possible when you begin. You then want to go into more narrow categories, and this is where the review becomes a bit more evaluative and also a bit more critical in its description. So the second would be in more narrow categories, and then you go into a bit more focus, and then you lastly state what the hypothesis is based on the missing information and the critique and the analysis and the evaluation that you've done in this review. So you're telling a story. You're starting as general as possible, and then you're going to more specifics, and then you're saying, right, based on this information, here is what I want to look at, and here is the gap in this research that I've just selected. As I mentioned earlier, you want it to be selective but substantial. So selective means you're picking out those papers that are relevant, but substantial means you've given enough detail that you've really kind of pinpointed what the missing part is of your kind of topic. So before we even think about the literature review, we need to think about the research question. Now, if you're in the STEM subject, you probably have this question defined for you pretty in a lot of detail. So like a general PhD in a STEM subject like science or biology may have funding already, and this funding is defined based on the research question. So the supervisor applies for funding and they ask for funding for a very specific bit of research. So you don't necessarily have a lot of autonomy when it comes to deciding what the question is, although you can have some leeway as to maybe what methods you use, what technique you use, or what the specific focus is. Whereas in the humanities or the social sciences, you may not necessarily have a specific question, and so you actually need to design that yourself. Now, there are four main types, I would say, of research questions. The first is a descriptive one. This type is a question that describes what's going on. So, for example, you might want to run a survey or have a questionnaire to identify what people in a specific area think about a specific thing. And that's just a description. You're not finding out why or how or when or going into much depth. You're simply just finding out some information. And that's the first type. The second is a comparative type. This is also known as relational or causal. And so you're comparing two sort of variables against each other. So what is the effect of one variable on another variable? And so that's a comparative type. The third type is experimental. Now, if you are doing, for example, a biology-based PhD or a biology-based research, then you're probably looking at an experimental type of research question. You have two or more variables that you're comparing against each other, but in this type, you probably are going to change one of the variables. So you might increase a concentration of something, you might remove one of the variables to see the effect on the other one. And this question will be quite measurable. So you might be doing some sort of experiments where you're measuring the length, the size, the amount, the concentration, the effects through some sort of experiment. So this is another type of research question. And then fourthly, you have historical. So this one, you tend to be asking the whys, the causes, the hows, the whens, what happened in that event, So this would be a historical type of research question. So think about what your topic is and what kind of question you want to be looking at if you do need to formulate your own question. And even if you have a question already, where does your question fall? What kind of research question is it? This does really make a difference when it comes to the review that you're writing, the literature that you select. Now that you've formulated your research question, you want to think about the outline of your literature review. So this is a work in progress simply because the more that you read, the more you might think this topic is interesting and you might want to change up your order a little bit. But it's good to think about the outline and sort of how you're going to draft your literature review. So what I've said is to use similar theses to help you structure your review. So if there is a thesis of someone who has published recently, who finished their PhD recently, you might want to look at their review to understand what topics do they think is most important to sort of support their research. I've given these 3 types of structures. The first is a chronological order, the second is schools of thought or arguments, and the third is boundaries of research. So the first one is chronological order, and that simply describes the order of things happening. So this could probably be, for example, the order of time. So when do things happen? So if you're maybe discussing a particular event in history, you might want to go in chronological order from sort of the first thing that happened and how that led to the events, the later events. The second one is schools of thought or arguments. So if you're thinking about a topic where there's different kind of points of views, then you might want to think about the schools of thought and arguments. So this would be maybe a point of view type of literature review. And the third is boundaries of research. So imagine a Venn diagram. So a Venn diagram has overlapping sections, and you've got this bit in the middle. So this bit in the middle is your research. And you want to think about what is it that fits into these gaps. There might even be another circle here. There might be another circle here. What topics overlap in order for your research to be understood? For me, I was looking at the actin cortex. So actin cortex went in the middle. Topics that were on the side were actin, myosin, the actin cortex, the cytoskeleton, movement, cell division. All of these topics were around this Venn diagram because my research was on a boundary of other topics. So it wasn't really sort of one specific topic by itself. So think about these 3 structural possibilities and which one you want to go for. Again, you can change it. Not all reviews will suit all of them. For me, it wouldn't make sense to do chronological order because there isn't really an order for anything, but definitely the third one fits for my PhD. So here is the introduction for my thesis, and I thought it would be nice to see an example of the kind of content that I would include for my type of PhD. So here I had 1.1, 1.2, all the way down to I had 1.7, but I've just kind of left it as it doesn't fit on this page. And you can kind of see how I've sort of planned my structure. And you want to plan it in a similar way. So I've started off with the largest, most general part of my research. That would be the molecule, and that what I would say would be actin. So let's say that's my molecule, that's actin. So that's 1.1. I've then gone on to 1.2, which are the proteins that bind to this actin. So here's my actin, here are the proteins that bind to the actin. That would be 1.2. So we're now going sort of in more depth as we go along. Then 1.3 is actin nucleators. So those are proteins that cause this actin molecule or the actin filament to nucleate, so to form. So that's looking at more proteins that help these guys to form. So again, we've gone into more detail. Then number 1.4 is nucleation promoting factors. So it's factors that help this thing to happen. Then we've gone into even more depth and saying, look at the actin cytoskeleton, which is what is made up of this. So you've got your cytoskeleton here, and that is kind of made up of there. And then I went into even more depth and looked at more properties of this. And you can see kind of how that staggers and how that looks. So the most general thing, then the next thing, then the next, and then lastly, where this leads to. It wouldn't make sense for me to start talking about these promoting factors without knowing what actin is, what the proteins are, etc. So you want to think about your project in a similar way. What is the most general piece of information that someone needs to know? then what's the next thing, and what's the next thing? And maybe even something that you could do is work backwards. So why not start here and say, right, I'm looking at the promoting factors. What is the thing that I need to know those? And I'll say, right, I need to know the nucleators. So what's the thing that I need to know that? You need to know those. And kind of maybe go backwards if you're not 100% sure the order.